This is going to be, there's really no written history of the mountain area other than a chapter in Colonel Banks' 2-volume History of York. Mountains always had an oral historic background, and this is what this is going to be. It's nothing but an oral historian's view of it. I have no notes or any background material that I'm going to refer to, but I will give you references and things like that. The first thing that comes to mind is, where does the name Agamenticus come from? And that's a question that will probably never be answered. There's about 3 or 4 different variations. In Colonel Banks' history, he talks about Agamenticus, and I'll just warn you people about using Colonel Banks' history. He was not a historian. He does not document a lot of his sources, and some of them are oral or hearsay or whatever, so you have to be careful, although he is accurate for the most part. In his book, he says that Agamenticus is really the name of the river, York River, and it comes from a type of Algonquin term that refers to the thatch beds or the marshes at the parting up and back of McIntyre Garrison. And he extrapolates that from an Algonquin word. Fannie Mae Ekstrom, who wrote a book on Indian place names in Maine, and probably the eminent authority on that, she takes Agamenticus to mean pond at foot of Great Hill, so she takes it as being the name of Chase's Pond, because Chase's Pond was first called Agamenticus Lake, or Agamenticus Pond, and York River was first called Agamenticus River. So the third one is there was a tribe related to the Pennacook tribe that lived at Exeter, and the transliteration into early colonial English was Agamenticus, Accomenticus. They supposedly lived at the foot of the mountains, and they were wiped out in the Great Whooping Cough epidemic, I think in 1626, which decimated all of the native population on the coast. So when the first people came to York, there were no Native Americans here because they'd all died of the whooping cough. So you can take the choice on any of those 3 as to where you want it to come from. Also, it's been referred to in Banks' history as Sassanoa's Mount, supposedly named after a Wabanaki sachem called Sassanoa. He offers no reasoning where he got that from, whether it was a folk tale or what. I've heard it as a folk tale. The first mention of Agamenticus, I think, is in 1602 by Gosnell, when he first surveyed the coast from his boat and picked up the prominent landmark. John Smith also identified it, but he was like a lot of people that are from away. He named it a word similar to Snowden, but it was named after a hill in a town that he came from in England, and thank God that name went away. So it went back to Agamenticus. And we don't know who the first person was to conquer the summit. You may laugh about that, but the local artist Peter Grafiotis used to publish a humor satirical magazine based upon the mythological village of Tatnick, which lies just to the northeast of the mountain. And Pam was here. I think she probably read the edition. At the time that he published one edition, there was a Japanese mountaineering team that was getting ready to conquer Everest, and he wrote that they set up a base camp at the foot of Mount Agamenticus, set a camp up halfway up, and they were the first ones to make it up the mountain. You'd be surprised the number of people that believe that. But Agamenticus is really very, very unique, at least to our family and a lot of people, because of the biological diversity there. Agamenticus was one of the first places that was botanized in southern Maine. Members of the Joslin Society, which is the premier wildflower organization, came here in the 1870s and 1880s. The eminent botanist Kate Furbish, she was the one that stopped the Agamenticus Dickey Dam project. I don't say she, a flower named after her, the Furbish lousewort, stopped the Allagash Dickey Dam project in the 1970s. She came here in a book just published by Bowdoin College. I recommend people get it, on Kate Furbish. Beautiful watercolors of her that she did in there. And there's a little short section in there about her botanizing Agamenticus. I don't want to get too far ahead, but just to say in that same vein, when we did the study, the U.S. Department of Agricultural study in the early 80s, all the mountain area, the state biologist Les Eastman came down here, spent about a month and a half and published a little booklet. I think there's a copy in the library, and there isn't. I'll see if they get a copy. And it's over 250 species of flowers and flowering shrubs that he picked up in the Agamenticus area, some of which only exist in the Agamenticus, such as the eastern dogwood. It's on two or three stands on Second Hill. There's none in New Hampshire. There's about a half dozen in Massachusetts. You have to get all the way down to lower in the Appalachians. And of course the chestnut oak. Nobody understands why it grows on the east side of the mountain to just north of the mountain, just north of Third Hill, almost over to the Josias Brook. The nearest stand of chestnut oaks is the Charter Oaks in Hartford, Connecticut. So how you had a dispersal of acorns like that is beyond me. But the chestnut oak is a predominant tree species on all three hills. And at one time, the two major exports from York were ice and firewood, and the firewood being chestnut oak. Now the mountain, and I'll try to confine my talk to just the mountain and not the mountain village, which is a separate area that Pamela Wallace has been working on for a number of years, finding how frustrating it is. The mountain had a number of families that lived directly on the mountain. The Fitzgeralds, the Lewises, and the Welches. Most of the other families lived what's known as Agamenticus Village or lower down. The Fitzgeralds were the only ones that lived right up on the mountain itself. And it's interesting that the mountain area was the last area settled in York. It wasn't settled until the early 1800s. York had been settled for over 200 years before anybody settled the mountain area. And there's a good reason, because it's the worst possible land in an agricultural society that could ever exist. So the only people that went up there were the poorest people in the world. When it was subdivided as the Outer Commons in 1754-56, and Daniel Sewell did the map, there only shows one person living up there. And that's lower down in the village. Nobody on the mountain, no roads, or nothing. So it isn't really until about 1820s, 1830s that people actually move up on the mountain. They don't last over 100 years and they're gone. They're not there anymore. That's why there's so many cell holes up there. On the lower part of the mountain where the Lewises live, there are 8 Lewis cellar holes. And it's very hard to follow the families up there. They didn't read, they didn't write, they didn't do wills. When they did deeds, they would dictate it to a lawyer, and then he'd sign it, not knowing whether what they dictated was on the deed or not. And that's why when the state, the Land Information Futures Board, started buying land up there, they found out it cost more to research the land than it did to buy it. Because you can go 100 or so years and not know who owned it. Because there's no will, there's no deed. Most of the people that lived on the mountain were subsistence farmers. The only industry was basket making. And the problem with people up there making baskets is, where's the market? And that was the major problem. There's a good picture in Holyoke, and it's, I don't know if it's Elisha Lewis or Calvin placed it, I think it's Elisha Lewis, and he would take and attach like 35 or 40 baskets to him, all on his legs, tie them all around his body, all around his arm, and around his neck, and it would look like a giant bundle of baskets. And he would walk from the mountain to push them. Obviously, people would pick him up in those days in a horse and wagon or something like that. In those days, if you were walking down the road, the first person by stopped, you want to ride. So he didn't actually, although I'm sure that he did. In Dennis Robinson's series that you see in a portion of Harrow once in a while, about a year ago there was a picture of a wagon parked in the square in Portsmouth, right in front of where Reraz is. And it's my great-great-grandfather with about 150 mountain baskets. And he used to buy them up and get a big store of them, and then load his wagon, and then go to Portsmouth and sell them. As I say, it's hard to imagine how poor the people in this area really was. A lot of the houses, all they were a rough platform or a dirt floor, and then take and cut down a small pine, flatten out one edge, that would be your stud, and then they would get slabs or boards off a local mill and nail it up, and that's it. They might have 2 windows in the house, obviously no plumbing. On all of the mountain houses, the well was always downhill from the house and or the barn. That's why there were so many young deaths in the mountain because of typhoid fever, because their wells were polluted. All the wells, and they're still there, are hand dug. They're all on the edge of swamps. It's the only place you can find water, and that's the only place you can dig. So you could see why health was a real problem up there. And it's interesting that the Maine cemetery up there, which is where the Lewises are, is all fieldstone, head and foot, without a name on it. Across the street is another small Lewis cemetery, and the only stone in the mountain that has a name on it and a date is an illegitimate Lewis child. And I found that, somebody must have thought an awful lot of that little baby, because there's no other stones up there. They're all fieldstone, and then there's this beautiful little marble stone with a nice verse about this little baby that died of typhus about 2 years of age. And a thing like that must have been one huge expense to have a marble stone cut and moved up there. Now, the history of the mountain. It has a checkered history. I guess we could switch up to one of the pictures. And one of the reasons, the source for the checkered history is this gentleman right here. That's Joseph Albert Riley. Neil Ramsell referred to him as the famous mountain liar. He created more lies about the mountain than any man ever. And unfortunately, they've been passed down, and we'll get close to this, as per verbatim history. These are the mountain families coming back from a day on Gunker Beach. As Joseph, his daughter Catherine, my uncle Henry, John Maine's in there, John Maine's mother's in there. I think I've identified about maybe 8 or 9 of them. And that's probably taken about, I would say 1918, 1917. Henry's about 5 or 6 in there. He was born in 1912, so that's probably the period when that was taken. You can see that not only were the people in poor health, that is exactly something you'd see running at the Kentucky Derby. Any picture that I've seen of a horse at the mountain, they're all the same, because where can you grow grass up there? Very, very rarely. This was the only social place at the mountain. This is from about, I think about 1880, and this is Steve Kozak's house up on Groundnut Hill. It was called the Groundnut Hill Tea Room. And my grandmother told me, and I've had other people tell me also, that the largest selling tea was marijuana tea. The older ladies like to come there for it, and cinnamon toast. My grandmother didn't work at this tea room, but she worked at the fan club tea room that used to be on the shore road near the entrance to Perkins Cove. I remember a lot of people remember the dancing fan. And she said that they would come there in their cars, driven by the chauffeurs, have 3 cups of tea and 2 pieces of cinnamon toast, and promptly fall asleep. This was the only social, and the other thing, not a picture here of it, there was a photographer's studio that set in back here. A mountain seemed to attract a lot of photographers because the way of life really didn't change over the years. Emma Coleman wasn't the only one. Fred Quimby was another one. Charles Trafton was another one. So there's a large collection of glass plates at the library that are taken over a period of years by these different photographers. It also attracted linguists. There were a number of recordings made from WPA grants just before and during the Second World War of mountain singers, because their language was the closest thing to the pre-colonial English spoken in America. And that's why linguists went up there and recorded the people. There was 2 musical artists here this summer. They gave a concert, and I think about 90% of the songs came from the mountain. The only industry at the mountain was logging. This is my grandfather, Norris Trafton. That's George Albert Moulton in the Derby, Bert Carrier, and Oliver Jennings, the songwriter. The list that I got from those people, I think there were 60 songs that man had committed to memory. See, he's got his tie on and his vest, and he's got a white shirt and a derby on, and that's the way they worked in the woods, because usually that's the only clothes they had. And that is taken over on what's known as the Hoss Hills, which is just to the southwest of the mountains. There's the hills. The first mills up there were steam mills, and the firemen lived in a little shack where the boiler was. You had to keep the boiler going 24 hours a day to keep a head of steam up. So the whole time that they were cutting, that poor guy had to live in there. I mean, it wasn't much bigger than I think it was probably about maybe 6 by 6. And he had to sleep in a cave. You can see these. And like most people at the mountain, that horse was Blackie and that horse was Whitey. They didn't really spend a lot of time on names. This is my grandfather's steam mill, and that's set up over in Oscar. This is Young's mill. This is up on the Folly Brook, and that was steam right there, and also water power. And that dam is still there. This is an interesting one because they didn't rarely use oxen in the woods. They used oxen for when they wanted to haul wood out of the woods. But as far as working in the woods, it was very, very rare to see oxen. This is a very interesting one. This is Samuel Paul from York Beach, and he had a sawmill set up at the base of what's known as Hedgehog Rocks. Hedgehog Rocks is as you go around the mountain, you come out on a high cliff, and you can look out a long distance, and there's a high cliff there. And it's called Hedgehog Rocks. The Englishmen named it because they thought porcupines were hedgehogs, from England. So that is known as the Hedgehog Rocks. So it's about a 50-foot cliff and about 75 feet uphill, So that's Samuel Paul and the steam mill, and he built, see rails here? You see the next picture? He built the one and only railroad on the mountain. And here it is hauling lumber, and there's a cable, as you can see here, that goes down onto a big, to a steam, and it's hooked on the front of that to another pulley. There's Samuel Paul and his two sons there. So that's the only railroad ever built on the mountain.
And what size of mountain was this on?
This is, as you go around the mountain, after you go onto the dirt part, you don't go 150 yards and come right up on a real sharp corner, and you can look way off in the distance. There's a high cliff there. It's a beautiful lookout. Just pull over, stop, and walk down there on the ledges. And that's called the Hedgehog Rocks. That's a better picture of this.
Any remnants up there?
The only thing that's down is at the foot of Hedgehog Rocks is the base of his mill. Knowing these people, they disassembled everything and hauled it on. A lot of the houses at the mountain were made of houses that had fallen down, houses that were abandoned, because everything had to be sawn by hand. And the road was practically non-existent for probably most of the year. Probably you couldn't use the road. I know my aunts were saying about they were the first ones to go to the high school on the mountain, and how much school they missed because you couldn't. This is in the 20s and 30s, because you couldn't get there. And that was in the 20s and 30s. And you got to remember, U.S. Route 1 at the time was still dirt. So it's extremely isolated, very isolated. And this is the first steam mill. That's my Uncle Henry. Steam mill, gasoline mill, excuse me. That's my Uncle Henry, and that's set up in back of the line house over on Route 1, cutting down there for Carroll Tractor. And boy, that was, he worked on the last steam mill that my grandfather had. He said, boy, what a joy this was to be able to go in and push a button. And it went. That's a picture. But you can see, other than the motor, nothing's changed. It's the same carriage, the same saw, the same substantial structure. This is a very interesting picture for a number of reasons. This is Royal Briley, Joseph A. Briley, and Joseph A. Briley Jr., and they're doing stonework on the shore path at York Harbor. They went up to, they were originally from Greenville or Greenfield? Greenfield, New Hampshire. And Joe was very enterprising, and he went up there and he liberated part of a stone dam and brought it down, and it was used in a number of places on the shore path. And, you see he's got his bar. And I haven't been able to figure out, and my Uncle Henry couldn't either, just where that was. That would be about 1930, 31, somewhere in that era. So with the vegetation stuff, I don't see any houses, unless that's a roof or something in back of Junior's head, but I still don't know where that is over on the shore path. But it's interesting. They think that the people in the harbor hired them to come down off the mountain to do the stonework. Very interesting. This is placed at the tomb. Franklin placed it, and his brother built this, and they lived off to the right of it. It's in perfect shape today. It's made up of 3 stones on the roof that are about 4.5 feet wide. Those are about 2 feet thick. That's about 14 feet long. And they dragged those from Ida Johnson's quarry, which is where Larry Willie's quarry is now, that was in the papers and everything, off the old mountain road. I don't know how they haven't dragged them all the way up there. I mean, it's probably, I would say, a good mile and a quarter they had to drag them. And all that cut stone came from that quarry too, because there's no places in and around there where they did quarry stone other than that quarry over there. The door is still there, and it's lying right there. It's a hand-hammered iron door, and it weighs about a ton. I tried to pick it up and lean it against the old door frame, and it's made of iron with iron with iron. It will last forever. The only inhabitant is an eastern wood phoebe that lives in there every year. Every year I go in there, there's one phoebe. And its nest goes in the same nest every year. But if you don't know where it is, I can show you. I've told people where it was. Milton Todd walked in there one time, and 4.5 hours later he came out of Wild Irish Earth Time on Route 10. You got to be careful, because it's real easy to get lost. So, but that's an interesting place. I have another picture taken in 1945, and the mountain minister Stanley Stevens is holding his Easter sunrise service on top of the tomb, because they couldn't be on top of the mountain because it was an army base off Plymouth at the time. They used to hold there'll be a picture coming up shortly, I think.
Hey, Ron, why did you build that tomb?
He and his brother built it for themselves. And one day they found Franklin dead in the road. And they don't know, he got drunk and died of exposure, or had a heart attack, because obviously there's no autopsies. And I don't know where he was buried. His brother, who my grandmother said was touched in the head, was noted for his singing real loud at night, especially on the full moon. He had a ball at that lunar eclipse. You could hear him all over the mountain, because the mountain at that time didn't have any vegetation, hardly. There was no ambient noise, no cars, no trucks, no planes, nothing. So sound carried a long way. And I should have mentioned that people in the mountain communicated by holler. Right out in the front yard and holler to somebody a half mile away, and then they would hear you. I mean, that's why a lot of people from the mountain still talk loud, I guess. This is the first forest fire warden. This is Robbie Ramsdell, Neil Ramsdell's father. He's setting up on some flat stones. The first tower up there was a wooden tower with an open platform, and he had to buy his own umbrella to sit up there during the summer. And they have this map that supposedly came from the tower, and I thought it was interesting because there was no roof on the tower. So I don't know whether Robbie took it home with him every day. I have no idea, because there's paper and you wouldn't have it out in the weather. And he had it on a table that he cut out of a stump and sat in the middle of that wooden platform. And the last picture I saw of that wooden platform was when, let's see, Mildred Avery and her husband got married in front of that wooden platform, and that year they tore it down. Somewhere the Averys have a picture of it. I've been trying to figure out which Avery has got it, because we don't have a picture of the tower. This is the first tower. Went up there in 1939. This picture's taken in 39. And evidently the first wave of tower, he climbed up the outside of it, I guess. My grandfather hauled it up there with his horses in sections, because the mountain road as we know it wasn't there. There is a road that goes to the summit, but it's quite a bit longer. And it leads up through where the parking area is now. There was also a foot trail that went straight up, which is now basically where the cable line that runs up the mountain. And halfway up the mountain, there used to be a halfway house, octagon roof on it, was screened in. People go up there to have picnics and stuff like that. And this is going to be a topic for discussion. You see there's quite a stone pile that he's sitting on. The next picture. This is the War Department map from 1941 when the government acquired it. And up in this corner, it talks, there's two things mentioned. There's a stone monument from 1847, and then there's a later boundary marker. They changed the summit. I don't know how it moved from 1847 to 1908, whether there was an upheaval or something. But I think we go to the next picture. Do you have that picture on there of them standing, of them standing on
On the
top,
rock tower?
on top of the stones?
Yeah, I thought it was in there. I guess I can't. I don't know
Okay,
where.
all right,
Yeah, I
we'll
don't know
see.
where.
All right,
In there
we'll
somewhere. Maybe
we'll
you'll
come to
to
it. There's a stone pile right back there. This is when they're starting to build the fort. This is last year that Reverend Stevens had his sunrise service up there. Roger Currier. There's my Aunt Avis, my mother, my Aunt Alice, Ray Welch, Mildred Welch, Reverend Stevens, his wife. And they used to hold their sunrise service up there. You can see how many people would show up. That's another picture of the stone pile also here. This is the first radar station ever built in the United States. 1941. This is the boiler building, you know, that tall structure there. And that's a wooden tower. I can remember climbing that when we were kids because you could get underneath the fence and get in there because the place was all abandoned and how rickety it was. And we used to see who could go the highest, and then you'd tie your handkerchief or whatever you had with you and see if the next guy could go up and move it. I think the only thing left now is the concrete piers, and they're probably under that platform where some of this sculpture's going, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's right on top of that. There's another picture of the Army. You can see how big this was. They had dances on Saturday night. That was a highlight for the mountain women. Go to the mountain and meet the Army guys. I know of one wedding, Charlotte, can't remember her maiden name, married Elton. Valentine, Barry Valentine was in my class, ex-head of the FAA, and his father was stationed there, and met his mother. She was a telephone operator. Now, when they built this on the mountain, there was no power and no phone in the Agamenticus. So they brought the power in from Clay Hill Road, from Algonquin, and it came to the mountain village, and then up the road to the tower, but not down the road. They brought the phone line in from the mountain road opposite flows and up the mountain road that way. So when I was a kid and went to my grandmother had a phone, but she didn't have power. She said kerosene lamp. They didn't put power on the mountain road until 1948. So you can see how things might be behind up there. But the interesting thing is that when they put the power up the mountain, nobody tied into it. Because they couldn't. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford to have an electrician. And I would say probably your great-grandfather's place over there was probably one of the earliest ones to have power because they had the ability to purchase it. But yeah, most of the people at the mountain it didn't mean anything to them. Next picture. And one of the, that's Chase's Pond, as you see this area right there, that's probably Chase's Pond. So that's looking over towards York Building.
What was the purpose of all this up there?
In case German planes, it was a pickup German plane coming to bomb America. And this was the highest point on the East Coast between Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and Mount Desert, and close to Boston. I think that was probably why it was the first one that had radar. I mean, it's quite a number of buildings there.
Ron, can I encourage you to take a step backwards? You're blocking.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Get back to that stone pile. There was another picture, and I guess it didn't begin.
I thought it was one of the first pictures in
I
the
did
show,
too.
wasn't it?
I did
Did we lose
too.
it
They were
somehow?
standing on it.
Right.
One slip.
Yeah, could you go back to
People
that
standing
place?
on the,
Because I want to put this there.
No.
No?
no,
No?
That's the only one we saw.
Okay, there's another picture that I had, and it shows two women and a little boy standing on top of the big stone pile on the mountain. It was taken in 1892, and if you look at it closer, you can see the steps going up, and then on the top of it, between one of the women and the boy, there's an obelisk that comes up out of the stone pile. And the obelisk is the same as those placed on the New Brunswick, Maine border after the Aroostook War of 1845, and the Treaty of Ashburton that ended in 1847, and they surveyed the Maine boundary, and they put those granite posts up. They also did a survey of the east coast, the Water Department did, and I think that post that's in that picture on top of that stone pile is the one placed there by the Water Department and referenced in that 1847 plan. That stone pile was an observation platform built to get people up above the tree line so they could see. The hotels in Gunquit used to bring people over. E. Marshall built the Marshall House, bought land at the mountain because he was going to build a place up there so people could get the fresh mountain winds and all that. And he used to bring people up there. So that stone pile now is called St. Aspenquid's grave. Okay? There was never any such person as St. Aspenquid. John Bardwell, in his History of the York Waters District, refers to him as one of the praying Indians from Massachusetts. The praying Indians were Protestant, and Aspenquid is obviously Catholic. We know who all the praying Indians are. There were no praying Indians in the province of Maine. So, who is this guy, St. Aspenquid? Really what it is a lie. The whole thing is made up to attract people to the mountain. My great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, my grandmother told me all about these stories that they made up because they used to bring people over from Algonquin. When you get up on the mountain, even today, and I pointed it out to Robin Kerr, who's the lady of the mountain now, great asset. After they cut off all around the front, I said, Robin, look at all the St. Aspenquid's graves down there. Everywhere you look, going down the slope in front of the lodge, are big stone piles. They were built by the Lewises and the Fitzgeralds to improve the land for their sheep. So they didn't have anything to do during the day, nothing. So they picked up stones and they piled them up. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere. They're not Native American graves. Native Americans didn't do that. But in 1890, I can't remember the year, when George Placid published his History of York, he talks about St. Aspenquid and how he thought it came from a name of a festival in New Brunswick and all of this. And he tells a story that the natives at Agamenticus told, is that St. Aspenquid was buried in a cave with a large stone rolled over the entrance, a la Jesus Christ. And above it, in Indian writing, was a sacred inscription. And it was the story of Jesus. And you know, the mountain people weren't very progressive, I guess. But it became accepted. It accepted that stone pile, St. Aspenquid's under there. And then Kenneth Roberts, his book, Boone Island, he talks about the big bonfire they saw. It was when they cremated St. Aspenquid. They killed 537 moose and all that stuff. And that's always been the story about the cave. So I talked to my grandma about it. She said, you know what? She says, your grandfather had been on every square inch of that mountain and probably cut between the 3 generations, every tree there ever was. There ain't no such thing. So one day I was in the library and I was talking to Virginia Spiller about it. And she said, oh, she said, I had an interesting conversation with Joseph A. Riley. And he told me that there was a cave up there. St. Aspen was in it. And he knew, because he had been in it, and he had seen the bones. He'd seen over the door Indian writing, except they don't have a written language. So she said, well, Joe, where is it? And he goes, oh, when they built the road to the top of the mountain, they covered it over. So fast forward to 1960, when we're going to build a ski slope on the mountain. And they're doing construction up there. And the remnants of the stone pile are still there in the old Army fort. And Ralph Armston, who was the head construction guy up there, had bulldozed them all down and everything. And he was sitting around having lunch one day. John Parkhurst, who was a laborer there, who lives over in Exeter now, and I called him on the phone, and he confirmed the story 100%. And he was the head of the ski patrol. Ralph Armston and Thurston Riley, Joseph A. Riley's youngest son, sat around having lunch. And they had just bulldozed down that stone pile to level that area off. And Thurston goes, you know what you just did? You just ruined St. Aspenquid's grave. And the mountain, when it was a ski area, they adopted a lot of Indian names like Abenaki Trail and the Algonquin Trail and stuff to build on this Indian theme. So they said, well, let's recreate it. Switch to another picture, it may show up in a minute. Keep going. No? Well, anyways, they built, want to switch back one, please? Sure. They built a stone pile, little tiny stones, put a white rail fence around it, and a big sign that said, Grave of St. Aspen. And it's good luck every time you go to the mountain to throw a stone on it. So when Robin went to do all the work up there, he said, you know, we need to move this, but I don't dare touch it. And I said, Robin. It was done in 1961. And there was a series of meetings, and a Native American, he called himself from North Berwick, showed up and said, you do not touch that. That is sacred. I will bring my brothers here and there will be warfare if you move that grave. And there was an article in the paper about it, and then I got a call from a Micmac in New Brunswick, and he said, you're all wrong. It's not St. Aspenquid, it's Abenquid. I got thinking, no, you're wrong. When York was raided in 1692 by Mark Donawando, the Penobscot chieftain, he had another sub-chief with him named Abenquid. At least we think it was in York, because when he raided Wells, Abenquid was with him. Abenquid signed a number of treaties, and I don't want to make this too long. The soldier that came here that had the garrison's name was Pascal Chubb. He was a political appointee. He knew nothing about being a soldier. Then they sent him down to Sagadahoc to redo Sagadahoc after the Macdonald verdict. The Indians came in under treaty, and one of them being St. Aspenquid. When they came to the gate of the fort under the white flag, they whipped open the gate and they blew them all away. And one of them was Abenquid, and they put him on a canoe like they always did, and canoed him all the way up the Penobscot River to the Indian Cemetery at Old Town, and that's where Abenquid is. So it's not Abenquid, and it's not St. Aspenquid. So that's all total fiction, and it's so hard to convince people that it ain't true, because it sounds nice. Be able to say that. Now there is one cave And I haven't been able to find it. I've talked to one person that had been in it, and then I talked to another one, and he told me about his uncle talking about it. It's mentioned in Bourne's history of Algonquin, and I have no idea why that would be mentioned in Bourne's history. But the cave is supposedly big enough that in case of a sudden snowsquall in the winter or the spring, you could drive a flock of sheep in it and get it in yourself. It's supposed to be over on Second Hill or on the Third Hill, but I've been around and around and around and around. I mean, there's a number of caves, but nothing to be anything of that size. So, settled in 1814, 1820, by 1910, everybody's gone. I had a lot one time I sold to a friend of mine, and it was where Josiah Lewis lived, and in the deed it said 1916 house fell down. That's what happened on most of them. I've got pictures of the mountain houses, and they're very dilapidated. I'll give you an example about how poor some people were. When my Uncle Henry first moved up there, at Agamenticus village, there was a basket maker living just up the road in a camp. That was a house. They had a little root cellar, and they all had a little root cellar. So one winter, just before it got dark, Henry walked up to see Elisha Lewis, and he always had fried pork always on the stove. So Henry said when he opened the door, it was like just haze, pork. But he said when he got on the stone step, he looked down, and it looked like a horse dropping on the doorstep. So he went in, how you doing, Elisha? Because Elisha bellowed, but he said about to blow you right out of the house. He talks so loud. So Henry said, well, what's that on the doorstep? He said, that's my supper. And he said, well, what is it? He said, that's a sweet potato. And he put it out there and let it freeze, bring it in and slice it, and drop it in the pork fat, get sweet potato chips. And that was his meal for the whole day. That was it. He also knew the last Lewis that lived up there, Samuel Edward Lewis. And I've got a picture of Sam Ed out in front of his house. Like, wow, can't believe they lived in such places. They freezed it out. And Henry said he went up there one day and he took him up a biscuit with butter on it that his mother just made biscuits. Gave it to Sam Ed, and he said, thank you. He said, but do me a favor, Henry, the next time. And he said, what's that? And he said, don't put butter on it. He said, because I've been so long since I had butter, I don't know what it's going to do to my system, so just bring it up dry. And that was all he had, was that biscuit. But there's no way to make a living. The only way to make a living is working in the woods. I have my great-great-grandfather's day books, my great-grandfather's day books, my grandfather's day books, of all the days they worked in the woods. They worked on Sundays, because if you could work, you worked. And nobody up there had coinage. Our family, the Moulton family, and John F. Placer were the only three that really dealt in coins, because they're the only ones that had any money. Everybody lived by bartering. Saturday nights, every Saturday night was a card game and cider drinking. My grandmother gave me the registry and the ledger of the the Ground Root Hill Christian Union Church, which was the first church up there. Except there was no church. They met in people's houses, but it was called a church. And it was in my family, and then boom, it stopped, but we kept the book. So I asked my grandmother about it. I said, why does it stop right there? She said, well, those mountain people. Because she didn't consider herself mountain people. She was born in York Beach. She was a mountain person. She had to live up there, but she was a mountain person. And she said, because they're all heathens. Really? I mean, what do you mean they're all heathens? She said, well, Saturday night, they play cards and get drunk. They don't care who they bed down with. And he said the next morning they're in church, they're down front, they're rolling in the floor, they're kicking their feet up, hallelujah, they're speaking in tongues. He said they're heathens. So my grandmother's family used to go all the way to South Berwick, over the mountain in wagon to church. They get up at 4:30 in the morning because you're not going to associate with those heathens. That later became the Agamenticus Christian Union Church, which is the white church in the village. And I think it tapered off a little bit. But it was a very, very insular community. People didn't vote. No reason to. And how are you going to get there? And what do you know it's about? You know, you don't read, you don't write, you don't go anywhere. So it's very, very insular, and I can see how easily it could have died out. There was no way to economically keep it going. Once the woolen industry, after the Civil War, when they opened up Idaho and Utah and the plains to sheep, that was the end of the woolen industry and sheep. I think my grandfather was probably the last one that kept sheep up there. And if you look at my great-grandfather's, my great-great-grandfather's day book, you'll see where they took their wool. South Berwick, Great Works, Dover Point. So, you know, that was the other thing, is raising sheep. But those people up there, I have no idea how they lived. I just can't imagine the extreme poverty that they lived in. I had another picture that isn't on here, and it's of Orrin Fitzgerald's house. Orrin Fitzgerald was the last person born on the mountain, and he moved lower down on the mountain later when his family house fell down. And there's a wood pile out in front of his house, and there's not a stick in that wood pile bigger than that. And that's all there are. And he's out there with his sister sawing up those little sticks because he didn't have any place to saw wood. He couldn't buy wood. So that's all they burned was saplings and stuff like that. The last man that lived up where the Lewises were, which was Frankie Goodwin, he used to walk down by Joseph Riley's house every day, and about 4 hours later he'd come back up the road and he'd have a piece of birch on his shoulder, about 20 feet long, staggering. And Joseph, being the aggravating person he was, as soon as he'd see him, he'd run out and try to get him in a conversation. So he'd stand there. And Joseph would be out there aggravating, trying to get him talking. Every day, that's what he burned. Anybody that burns birch knows that the bark has a lot of oil in it, and once you get it going, it'll burn. But yeah, he didn't. Every day, walk down. I don't know where he got it from. Nobody ever knew where he ever cut it from. But every day he would do that. So one other thing about Joseph A. Riley, there's a nice clipping at the library, and it's an article in the Boston Globe. There's a picture of Joe Riley, a big interview, and he's holding the paddle that George Washington used to cross the Delaware with. Because it's got GW 76 carved in it. But it was really carved by Lawrence Seavey from an oak branch that blew down in Hurricane Carol in '56. And he put it down in the clam flats under some stones for a year or two to age it. Sold it to Joe for $5. The other thing that Joe has is a gun that D. Boone shot a bar with, and it's got D. Boone carved right in it. And the article is like the guy is really believing. You're all right. So, you can see where you're in the name famous mountain. So I hope I didn't destroy anybody's fables about the mountain and the mountain area. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yes. There's a picture of my father in a bucket. You say, well, why is that there? That's done in 1951. And in 1951, my father had 5 men working for him. They work 44 hours a week, they're working $15.65 a week. You shoot one of those, you get $15 from the state of Maine. So he used to hunt them with dogs on snowshoes. And I hunted twice with him, and I'm telling you, you start at dawn, and you go to sundown, and probably only 1 out of 10 times you actually get close enough to a cat and a tree to actually shoot it. And, there were a lot more bobcats then because at the time the lumbering practice was called strip lots. So they cut off everything that you could possibly market, whether it be firewood. I've seen a picture of one of my grandpa's sawmill, and there's some sawn out lumber on the brow there that's no bigger than a slab. So they used everything. So that area came back, scrub and stuff like that, so it was full of jackrabbits. I mean, you hardly ever see a jackrabbit up there now. So there were a lot of bobcats. The next one, I think, is, yeah, that one hanging on the back, that's 51, is the biggest bobcat ever taken in the state of Maine. It weighed 36 pounds. The normal weight of a bobcat is 19 to 22 pounds. The thing was monstrous, and the state, you sent it to the state, and they had it. I think they never did bring it back. I don't know what they did with it. It was, you know, a record, but you had to cut off the tail. Also, at the time, if you brought in the 2 front paws from a pocket pine to the town clerk in York, right up until the 60, you get 50 cents a piece for them. That was state law. And the town clerk had to give you 50 cents a piece. Each pocket pine, but you had to have 2 front paws. They didn't want you bringing in one and getting 50 cents and then bringing the other one a day too later. These are the moltons on the first day of hunting season. That's they live right where Elvis Lumberyard is at Cape Bennett. They had the local cider mill, so they were very popular. And you can see they all got the deer on the first day. Donnie Moulton, Charlie Moulton, Everett Moulton, Robert Moulton. He worked in Everett's mill, and then one day he was sawing up some slabs to start a fire to heat the coffee on. He fell on the saw and killed him right in front of his father and his brother. But that was the first day. Ah, there it is. There it is. I knew it was in there. There's a sign. You can see the little tiny stones and everything. See, the elders wondered if Robin moved it off the mountain, it was going to be off there. This is a nice picture. These were taken by Doug Armstrong over at Kittery Point. These are some of his photos. And he took some really, about 3 or 4 years. Oh, yeah. Just a little history of this land up here. This was owned by York on a holding company. Bill Foster, Jim Lucas, Matt Murtha, Tom up at Western Point, raised the donkeys. Davison. Tom B. Davison. And this is they're the ones that set up the ski area, and Bill Foster. Bill Foster was early skier, one of the very earliest ski patrol, and they were the big push behind this. And I think in 1970, there was an Oklahoma businessman staying in Stage Neck named Tony Zahn, and he had dinner with Bill and Phoebe, and they told him about this, and he went up there and he goes, wow, this is great. I envision a 35,000 population community on the backside of the mountain. And he hired a relative of mine that was not very honest to start buying land. And Donald McKenzie, my mention his name. He's deceased, so he's fair game. And they set up a number of corporations, Agamenticus America Resorts, New World Realty, and there was another one, and North American Resorts and stuff. And Donald would buy land, and then he would sell it to two of the corporations to put a different name on the lot. And often he bought land, and he didn't know where it was, so he made up where it was. And, I mean, it was this incredible, incredible mess. And then they got hooked up with a gentleman called Charles Freddy, who formed a corporation called Maine, and he started selling the land, and it's been caused tremendous problems, especially in the South Village side. I know Dale Toby, a friend of mine, Toby Sheetmetal, lived in his house 18 years and then found out he didn't own the land. I mean, there was about 6 people right there, Stuart Preston, the chairmaker that lived next door, a number of people. And Don was said, gee, it would be nice if this woodlot, 3 miles of wood, was really on this road. And that's where he put it. So there was a lot of flim-flammering involved in it. When the mountain went bankrupt and York Corner called back the mortgage, they approached the town, and fortunately, we were able to buy it. And they owned about 136 acres, I think is what the town originally owned. Since then, it's expanded to Land for Maine Futures Board. When we presented the Agamenticus proposal to the Land for Maine Futures Board, it scored the highest of any proposal ever brought before the Land for Maine Futures Board. Scored higher, higher than anything. And a lot of it was due to the rare botanical features. They found a butterfly at Kilgore's Marsh at the foot of the mountain ski slope called the Hare Street, which is the only place that's known to exist in Maine, and it lives on a fungus that grows on the bark of Atlantic white cedar. And the only place Atlantic white cedar is left now in Maine is Kilgore's Marsh and the Great Heath in Saco. And Scott Eldridge stopped me in the post office last week, and he got a notice from the state that they discovered a rare butterfly never documented before in Maine on his land, but it's really on mine, but I didn't tell him to just but I'll tell him one of these days. Sorry, Scott, it's on my land. That's okay. It's called spice bush swallowtail. And spice bush grows in Second Hill Brook. It's the only place in the state of Maine that grows. My grandmother told me about it. She called it wild forsythia because it's yellow and it flowers before it leaves like forsythia does. So they call it wild forsythia. Very pungent, that's why it's called spice bush. Comes out very early, so it has that really pungent odor to attract morning cloaks, which are the first butterflies to come out in the spring. Nice shot of slope, the latest motor vehicle. That's down at the foot of the mountain, in the warming time. That's looking right up the slope. Never could keep the mountain going because being so close to the ocean, you got a lot of salt in the air going inland, and it would take it right off the slope. They had a terrible time, and they had this is the first ski area in Maine that had night skiing. They had night skiing, they had snow making equipment. That's probably a pipeline set up right inside, you would be surprised. But it never, with just, with it being so close to the coast, it just couldn't keep snow on it. And these are the famous trail rides, but we managed to persuade the correct Parks Department not to do it anymore because it eroded the trails terribly. But it was incredibly popular. Incredibly popular. And there's the latest photo, 1992. This is York Water District's contribution to the beauty of the mountain. Oh, I razz them over that one.
This is CMP and Boston to Maine Railroad. And this is some media company, I don't know whether Comcast owns that or who owns that one now, but the town gets a percentage from the tower and then every implement on it. That one there, they can't. I think the Coast Guard, the Secret Service is on that one, if I'm not mistaken. Then the fire tower is supposed to belong to the town because it says in the lease, when it ceases to become a fire tower for the state of Maine, it goes back to the town. So we actually own it, although they say they own it, but they don't. But they do pay us a fee for these, I don't know, there's a couple of dishes and stuff like that on there. And then the village fire department means it on a volunteer basis. It's too bad you can't go up there, we always used to. The view is just utterly fantastic. That's a new, they built it in the parking lot and then built a platform. And myself and a couple of friends went up there, it was just a platform. And we tried to stand up on the platform, impossible. I mean, the vertigo, big, you know, isn't it hard? But it was impossible, we had to like crawl on it. But anyways, they brought a helicopter up, lifted it up and poof, set it on top. So that's the second, and actually this is the second tower because if I'm not mistaken, the first steel tower was taken down and moved to another mountain. And I think this is the second one because if you look at the structure of this one and you look at the structure of that one taken in 1939, they're not the same. So somebody had told me, and I think David Hilton wrote a book on the forest fire towers. He said he was of the same belief. And he told me the name of the mountain where he thought it went in Maine. And why they would take it down. And I think he told me that he speculated the tree growth was getting up such that it wasn't up above it. So they brought in another tower that was higher. I don't know whether that's true or not. I wouldn't be surprised, but you can read it in David Hilton's book on Maine forest fire towers.
Whose idea was it to strip all the trees off the top? And who gave permission?
That was a plan that they had worked on for quite a while, because I don't know how many times that has been stripped off, or burned on. And having tree growth on there is really modern. I mean, you saw that stone platform, that was maybe 8 or 9 feet high. And that got people up over. So the idea was to give everybody the same view that was there for a long, long time. I mean, my mother said,
It's a genuine.
yeah, genuine.
That's the same Aspen tree.
Yeah, it's probably something she had good grades for Whitney.
Don't kill him.
He'll be fine. No, I know my mother and her sister said the same thing. They don't have the numbers of as you know, as it was in later years. That's because nobody ever cut anything. So it was always a ball summit. In matter of fact, the first descriptions in colonial times, it talks about a ball summit. So that's a fairly, I'm just hoping that they'll go to Second Hill, and I've talked to Robin about it, get a good botanist and go to Second Hill and dig up some of the dogwood seedlings, because the larger stand was on the mountain, but when they built the mountain fort, when they did the mountain army base and the ski thing, they pulled those down every dogwood. But somebody told me, and I think they're right, John Parker told me that Tom Davison dug up a whole bunch of them and planted them over on his farm on Eastern Point, and they're there today. Now, I've never been over there because everything's posted. That could get you in trouble. Any other questions? Or? Well, Second Hill or the Middle Hill, Agamenticus is just a little bit to the east. And then beyond the Gilman Mountain Swamp is the third hill or eastern hill. And I think they call them the three summits of Agamenticus because I've seen them Agamenticus first hill, Agamenticus second, Agamenticus third. I've seen Agamenticus middle hill, Agamenticus second hill, eastern hill. It all depends on the map that you're looking at, how they determine. But I think they say Agamenticus basically has three summits, although in order to get to the easternmost summit, you have to walk through a swamp in order to get to it. How can it be a summit if you go downhill into a swamp? How can it be connected? The mountain is connected to Second Hill by a ridge, and that's where the Fitzgeralds, the same with Fitzgerald, they live the highest on the mountain. And his brother, Nathaniel Fitzgerald, lived halfway up the ski slope on the backside. I have no idea what they did. Only one person lived over and back of Second Hill, and that was Alexander Thompson. And he and his wife and one other had a burial there. I took the cemetery guy over there this year so we could plot that cemetery. Because those cemeteries aren't on any maps. Because nobody knows who it is. Unless they do the deed research, then you do the deed research, and you know who's there. And that guy's doing a great job. I don't want to get started on cemeteries, but he's doing a fantastic job. Because there's over 200 private cemeteries in York. And the town is responsible for it, under state law. Which is good, because most of the families are gone and they've fallen into the hut.
Ron, do you know what kind of wood they made the baskets out of?
Oak and ash.
So it's the chestnut oak,
Red oak.
red oak. So I read it one time they put it up, the slats on a fire and it would kind of like burst apart if they use chestnut oak. And
Well, oak shed is pretty easy when it's green.
yeah,
And I think there's a picture, historic society of Calvin placed it, set in front of his shack, and the baskets and piles of shavings everywhere. And he's got a spoke shave, and he's splitting off pieces and stuff. And it is the most desolate looking scene you've ever saw in your life. Desolate. I mean, it just stumps around. You know, there's no trees, just stumps. And he's out there making baskets.
did you see the basket upstairs?
No.
Because that looks like it's oak, but it's been identified as ash.
They had to get ash from lower down. You had to go down towards Chase's Pond and lower down. Ash didn't really grow up on the mountain. Ash is the best. It splits easy. It's very pliable. That's what the Wabanakis made a lot of their baskets with. That's what J.P. Ware made all of his baskets with. Is green ash.
Is there a weed that makes them distinctive, or?
No, they used fairly basic things, and there were a few people that tried to do ornamental, and there are a few. Tony's got about the biggest collection of mountain baskets that I've seen. He's got a whole room full.
I have one, but the guy you just mentioned.
Elisha Lewis or Calvin placed it?
No, I got a lot of Elishas, but the guy you just spoke about,
They said.
terrible picture in his draw shave. He made
Oh,
unbelievable.
that's Calvin placed it.
Oh, okay, yeah, I got a big one, but
Yeah.
you could stand on it. I mean, it's so good. It's probably one of the best.
Well, see, they didn't have paper bags. They didn't have, canvas samples or anything else. Everything's in a basket.
Yeah.
I've got berrying baskets, just used for picking berries. Everything was in a basket. And in their houses, everything was stored in baskets. Didn't have bureaus, didn't have chest of drawers. They had baskets.
Baby did wonderful that.
What's that?
Baby did wonderful that.
Oh, Jake was great. Excellent basket. Yes.
What year was that, was the first, that LMF grant for Mount Ag?
Oh, wow. I'm the one that gave the presentation before Jimmy down on the year. I don't know, it was when it was first passed into law, so whatever year it was first passed into law. we went down to Augusta and made the presentation. And it was interesting because one of the person on the panel that picked the project, his last name was Vale, and he was the head of the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and he was from Texas. How we get up here, I don't know. But and Marion Fuller Brown was on the board, and Marion was there. And he made the statement, there's nothing in southern Maine worth preserving. And he launched Marion. Anybody knew Marion Fuller Brown? She was very feisty. And I'll tell you what, boy, she laid him out in lavender. And she wasn't very polite about it either. She was furious, you know, after he receives the highest possible score ever, and then have one of the people that picks the project say, there's nothing south of the Penobscot worth preserving. What an idiot. He later retired and moved to Lyman. And presented a mountain in Lyman, the Land for Maine Futures Board, and they accepted it. But I can't tell you the exact year. It had to have been 88, 89, somewhere in there.
Google it.
Yeah,
Any other questions? Yes.
Ron, we came to York in '49, and the first time my mother and I drove into the village, there was a wagon and old folk man, I since realized, one of the mountain basketeers, who, remember, of course, the town was full of huge elms, but there was one right in front of the post office.
Yep.
And in it was screwed in a wrought
Right, the Tire Hospital.
ring. And we came in, and that was my first introduction to York, was a wagon full of baskets, and the real character that was coming out of the post office.
Yeah, Ruby Young at Young's.
Oh, right, yeah.
Up on 91,
Yeah.
at Young Home, a big white with the pillars, and there's a kind of a shop right there. And she bought hundreds of mountain baskets. And she had a basket shop there for years, and that's where a lot of the mountain people bought their baskets and stuff, was Ruby. And Ruby would sell them out of that shop.
I was wondering if this fellow was selling them out of his wagon in front of the post office or not. And that would have been '49. Who would have still been left at that time?
Oh, Marshall Lewis, except he didn't have a wagon and a horse because he never had any money. And I'm going to say there was probably at least a place it up there still making baskets. What's his name? Lived right there next to Mountain Schoolhouse. Real place that was still alive. Let's see, 49? Yeah, probably. And he was a basket maker. I mean, all of them just about made baskets because what? You know, there was nothing else to do. You weren't picking up stones. I'm telling you, if you go in the woods up there, you will not see. I mean, the stone piles up there as big as this room. Somebody picked them up and piled them up, and it's just incredible. The woods are full of them. Everywhere. And it's amazing. And that was just over about a 90-year period. There and gone. Any other questions?
Oh, that was great.